The precise origins of the place known as Bottom at Moor are lost in the mists of time. However, what we do know is way back in the 12th to 14th centuries, the area was once part of the Royal Hunting Forest of Horwich. And, as the name suggests, nestling on the south side of Horwich Moor, it offered protection from the elements. With gentle sunny downslopes for farming, coal and stone deposits, and game roaming freely on the moor, it must have been quite a desirable place to live, even if somewhat remote and prone to harsh weather. The first recorded residents were in the 14th century, when the Greenhalghs lived at what is now Coleman's. Occupation of the site is believed to go back even further, to the days of the Royal Hunting Forest. In 1425, James, son of Geoffrey Greenhalgh, had a house and lands at Horwich Lee Wood. By 1473, they had 4 houses, and continued their interest in the area until around 1800. The family had a handloom textile business in the late 1700s, and a number of the cottages at Bottom at Moor are remnants of that enterprise. The house probably takes its name from the coal deposits mined nearby. With the rapid growth of Ridgway's bleach works at Walsuches in the early 19th century, Bottom at Moor became home of a number of bleach workers, and none other than Joseph Ridgway himself became the owner of both Coleman's and Moor Platt, the other large residence in the area. Joseph Ridgway's successor in the bleach works business, Charles Howarth, lived at Coleman's before it became part of the Leverhulme estate. It was sold in 1925 to the Ryder family. In the 1930s, Moorplatte was demolished and rebuilt by Frank Singleton, the former editor of the Bolton Evening News, and is today also owned by members of the Ryder family, who for many years ran a successful engineering business in Bolton. Before we examine the village in more detail, it is worth noting the significance of the Blundell Arms on what is now Chorley Road. It is a hostelry of considerable age and history. Formerly known as the Moorgate Inn, since it stood at the entrance to the privately owned grouse moors above Horwich, it was renamed when the estate passed into the hands of the Blundell family. The Moorgate was a stagecoach inn on the moorland route from Bolton to Preston, and had a toll bar when the route was upgraded as part of the Bolton to Nightingale's Turnpike in 1763. Dramatic tales of highway robbery are recorded from this period, the most notorious highwayman being Galloping Will Nevison. There was also a serious coach crash in 1785 when the Lancaster coach overturned near the Moorgate Inn, seriously injuring a number of passengers, the worst affected being those travelling on the outside. The lasting importance of the Moorgate Inn was confirmed with the presence of a local courtroom and jail, and as a place where inquests took place, most notably the one into the death of George Henderson, the traveller murdered on Horwich Moor in 1838, at which a local collier, James Whittle, was sent for trial at Liverpool Assizes. Whittle was subsequently acquitted. Before Cholio Road was upgraded to the standard we see today, an ancient winding road linked all the farmsteads on the moor en route to Horwich. It passed down behind Moor Platt and Coleman's into Bottomouth Moor, then back up to the Jolly Crofters, and on through Ridgemont. George's Lane opposite used to be known as the Horton Causeway, and was once the main route across the moors to Preston. It is likely that it was renamed after the ill-fated Scotsman who lost his life on the moor. One of the fascinating stories that has been passed down about the village concerns a Civil War battle that was fought nearby, which resulted in muskets and shot being left behind in a local barn. These were kept by the owners down the years until very recently. The ghost of a soldier killed in the battle is thought to haunt the barn to this day. The original 18th and 19th century village that still survives today was essentially one street fronting the old highway. The earliest census records from the mid-1800s show the main occupations to be farming, quarrying and weaving, with a significant number of residents working at Walsuch's bleach works during the Ridgeway era. Mr. Bleakley, the head ostler, lived in the cottages, and the end cottage was the home of Henry Carter, a well-known local businessman and councillor, who was affectionately known as Daddy Carter by the local children because of the Christmas parties he used to organise for them. He rose to become chairman of Horwich Urban District Council and used his power and influence to provide many important services for the residents of the area. Until well into the 20th century, Bottomouth Moor used to be quite isolated and relatively self-sufficient, providing its own farm produce, drinking water from the moorland springs, weaving its own cloth, and having its own shops and beer houses. Kitfield Farm was in the centre, and was once the home of the Phillips family, whose son Bill was killed in the First World War. The Mason's Arms used to be in the middle of the row of cottages alongside this large 3-storey dwelling. It is currently owned by Kath Pyle, and a former residence of Frank Petty. Originally, there was a carpet weaving factory on the top floor, whilst pigs were kept in the cellar. The old cottages were built back to back, resulting in a confusion over house numbers that persists to this day. Frank Petty explains.
The numbers along here are quite ridiculous. Postman's nightmare, I always call it. The end house here is number 12. Next to it is 43. And then next to that is number 13. Then you go to number 14, but there is no number 15, that is now 42. And 41 is next to that. And then you go to number, is it 17? And then they go on till you go to, as far as where I lived, at number 36.
Another beer house, Plumpton's, stood at the entrance to Old Lane. This later became the village co-op. It is remarkable that such a small community as Bottomouth Moor has supported 2 churches down the years. Stuart Whittle talked to Frank Petty about both the churches and about Horwich Methodist in particular.
I mean, it's amazing that Bottomouth Moor has managed to sustain 2 churches.
Yeah.
It's only a small community.
That's right, yeah.
Obviously, there's a special story attached to why New Chapel is where it is, which we'll cover elsewhere. But that came about, obviously, way back in 1716.
Yes, yeah.
But this chapel goes back to 1830s, I think.
So that's right, when they used to meet in one of the rooms.
Yeah,
I think it was the upper room of this end house here. I think that's what it's.
Wow.
What Mrs. Applin said in that book. I think I got the impression because she'd researched it. I think it was at the end room.
Right at the end.
Yeah, so that's where they first started the Sunday school, and then this part was only built on in the late 1930s. So up till then, you only had the main chapel building. This is relatively new, only just before the war.
The foundation stone was laid by Adam Mason of Montcliffe, bricklayer and quarry owner, in 1869. William and Anna Farnworth were two of the founder members, along with members of the Hart, Miller, Fox and Whittle families, the great-grandson of whom is the present chairman of Horwich Heritage.
Well, how old is this church this year?
141 years.
141. But it actually started a lot earlier than that. The actual group of people who began Horwich Moor Methodist Church started in the weavers' cottages behind the chapel, in one of the top rooms there. And they started off in 1834. And they chose this particular site because it was cheaper than higher up. But they had to build it like it is because of the water table, because Horwich Moor itself, the whole of it, is built on a geological fault line. And so there are springs and wells all along this area. And in fact, there is a well, or we've called it the well, under the chapel, almost in front of where I'm sitting now. We think the spring from the well, for the well, is underneath the Sunday school there, and it comes in through a lovely stone conduit under the floor, coming this way to the well, which is here, and it fills up the well, and when it gets to a certain height, it flows out through another conduit and out through under the front doors somehow, and into Old Lane, and empties there. It's a lovely little chapel. As you can probably see from the film, the way that the pews are mounted up behind us, that's because of the water table. It's a very unusual little chapel for this area of the British Isles, but I believe there are a lot more like this down in Cornwall, so I'm told. We have a number of interesting features as well as the well. We're one of the few Methodist chapels who have a crucifix in the chapel, brought to us from a local person whose husband was in the Royal Navy at the end of the Second World War, and came back and brought with him the little brass figure, and he was sent the olive wood later. They both came from the Holy Land, and so we're very proud to have that little crucifix, and it sits alongside the war memorial.
Well, I was christened here because my mum came from Tyneside, South Shields, to be in service, and she went in service at Riders. And on the first week she was here, on the Sunday, she said to the lady that was the washerwoman, who we called Auntie Al, "What do you do on a Sunday?" And she said, "Well, I go to the little chapel." So my mum came with her and came ever since, and until she died actually. And so I started coming, was christened here, and I've come ever since. So that was how my mum started to come to Horwich Moor. And in them days, they had operettas. Even in them days, I've got photographs showing of operettas. So it was still having concerts and things even in them days, all those years since.
The original founders were the Farnworth family, and sadly they've all passed away now, haven't they? All
as far as I know, yes.
All the descendants of the Farnworth family.
Yeah.
So we haven't anyone who's now connected with the origins of the chapel.
Further down Old Lane we find Suckling Calf Farm, formerly Higher Nevifold Farm, which in 1851 housed the Thornleys, a family of 6 struggling to make a living out of handloom weaving.
Yeah, this was Suckling Calf Farm. And during my time, during the war and soon afterwards, a chap called Fred Makinson lived in the end cottage there. I think he owned the second one as well. But anyway, he was a one-man haulage contractor, and he brought his lorry down the Old Lane every night and through it, and he had a petrol pump just behind here in a wooden, like a little, and he turned the handle and he'd fill it up with petrol every night and then round and into the barn. So that was all part of Fred Makinson's farm, as you might say. He didn't do any farming. I think this field there belonged to him, and this one here. And for a couple of years during the war, when we came back, the end cottage there, number 6, was where we rented for just a couple of years, because just at the beginning of the war we gave up in China at Richard, where we had a small holding, and came back, and so we managed to get in there. And I said my father then was working down at Whittles Farm. Right, during the war, well, about 1942, while we were still living here, the German bombers used to be coming round sort of almost every night, as it seemed, and we could see all the searchlights and the explosions and hear it and all that. And then you'd hear the bombers coming round, probably to do a rerun onto either Liverpool or Manchester, and we used to sit on this wall behind here, so that almost we could watch it like a display, which is not a nice way to put it, considering what was happening to Manchester and Liverpool. But this is what I remember. I think it would be 1942, because we moved up to bottom of Moor soon after that.
And just beyond is Cream Row, another set of properties with its origins in weaving. The next farmstead is Nevyfold Farm, or Nevison to give it its full title. It was formerly associated with the Nuttall and Ramwell families.
Back to the 1850s, my great-great-grandparents, the Ramwells, were farming here, and their daughter Elizabeth Ramwell, she married Jim Bleakley, who was just living up there at Cream Row, as it was called, in Old Lane, so they were about 100 yards apart. They were there for a few years after that, but jumping now to 1940, when we came back to Horwich, my father came working as a farm labourer for Fred Nuttall, who had this farm. That is the old barn, as I remember. The barn doors there, and they used to back the hay carts in with the horsing cart into there. And this is the yard and the stables round that corner.
Not many people know that W.H. Lever, later Lord Leverhulme, had an influence on Bottomouth Moor as well as Rivington. But here we have clear evidence of his distinctive style in the rebuilding of Nevyfold. Derek Dulson joins Stuart and Frank to talk about Bolton Fold Farm.
Bolton Fold has quite a checkered history. It started, as far as I can recall, in the 1600s when William Bolton came here as a bleacher. Most of the fields at Bolton Fold face south, and he used these fields for his bleaching cloths using tenterhooks. And of course he had to live somewhere, and the first part he built was this cottage on the left here, and you can see there was the entrance there. The door is still there, it's now stoned up. Then eventually he must have got more prosperous. He then came westward and he built this section here with the parlour and the bedroom over it. And in the wall of the gable end he put a date stone. At the top it says B, the surname, and then W.E., William and Elizabeth Bolton, 1720. And I'm not quite sure when this cottage that Shirley and I live in was added, but it's certainly well over 150 years old. And then of course the two were joined together, because there are sections in our house that allow you to go through into next door, and it would be fine really if it was reverted back to its original state as one big building. It could easily be done so. But before my grandmother came here in 1926, when she bought it off the Leverhulme Trust when it was put up for auction, my friend here, Frank Petty, his relatives lived here.
What time did Leverhulme come into this picture?
Oh, well, Leverhulme owned it then.
Right.
Because I just thought of something when Derek was saying about it. My mother recalled, and she would be a girl, I don't know, about 8 or 9 years old. She said Leverhulme came round with his horse and trap and his chauffeur, if you call it that. And apparently he said this farm just needed the roof redoing, right. But Nevyfold had to be rebuilt?
Now in 1902 or 3, Leverhulme, who was very keen on gathering as much property around him as he could, he came along and said he'd like to buy Bolton Fold, and in 1902-3 he bought Bolton Fold off the Vicar of Peel for, I think it was £1,500.
Oh.
And so the people then who lived here had to pay rent to Leverhulme. Now my grandmother at that time lived at Kitfield Farm, which was also owned by Leverhulme. But in 1925 Leverhulme died, and his family didn't want all this property, and so in 1926 my grandmother, who lived at Claypool as I said, went along to the Packhorse Hotel in Bolton and bought the Bolton Fold at the auction for £1,100. So Leverhulme lost £500 on the deal, didn't he?
Yeah. There used to be a funny story my mother used to like to tell about my Uncle Jim, and well, about my dad, who were about 10 or 11 years old, and they went to the old boys' school. They had to do milking and cleaning out the shippons before they went to school. So consequently, they're always on the last minute or late. You used to go across the bent, as we call it, you know, that's the path that goes across from New Chapel, yes, that way, and then they made their way down, and they would be frantically trying, they wore clogs, and they would be frantically trying to clean the cow manure off the clogs as they went down, and then down through the, well, the cemetery wasn't open then, so they'd go down, that would be just fields, I suppose. And Mrs. Allen, who's the teacher at that time, who at that time when my dad and my Uncle Jim were there, was called, she was Rose Makinson, because she wasn't married, but she was there long enough to teach me when I came back to Horwich in 1940. But my dad and Uncle Jim, they used to get there late, and they were always in disgrace. And one day, my Uncle Walter, who was a younger brother, he was different altogether, and he didn't do any farm work and that. He used to do more housework or anything than that. But he came home apparently, and in disgust, he said to my grandma, "Our Jim's a disgrace. He's had to stand at the front of the class again." You know, because you can imagine my father, to these two boys, being made an exhibition of stood at the front with a cow manure on the clogs and you know. But that was the story. But at 12-year-old. Or 11, 12-year-old. They were milking and cleaning out the shippons before they went to school. Yeah. You know.
Bolton Fold Farm is very old with mullioned windows. Moving inside, Derek pointed out an old crook beam frame, possibly from an even earlier house.
Well, as you can see, the people way back in the 1600s didn't bother importing things. They went out into the fields and picked a suitable oak tree, and here we are. This is the result. That on the left there comes straight up from the kitchen, and it has a Y-shaped crook in it, and the cross beam just fits in nicely, and also the cross beam across the top from the local area, and there we are.
Moving along the track to New Chapel Lane and turning left, we come to New Chapel House, once the home of Richard Pilkington, grandson of the old squire, but more recently connected with the Ryder family of Colemans, who presided over Rose Queen ceremonies in the gardens between the wars. Evidence of how isolated this area once was is provided by the photograph of the lane when it was gated, prohibiting access to Claypool, Brasley, Chorley New Road and beyond. New Chapel is worthy of a documentary of its own, and several comprehensive histories have already been written about it. However, only a short account of its fascinating story is possible here.
The chapel in the fields, as it was known, was not put here by chance. It was the vision of three men, Robert Greenhalgh, Hugh Whittle and Adam Hodgkinson. Their vision was to create a new chapel away from the existing chapel in Horwich. This breakaway church was established in 1716 in response to the Act of Uniformity of 1662, which endeavoured to impose the Book of Common Prayer on all churches. The Horwich dissenters, in common with others across the country, became so influential at the Horwich Chapel that they were persuaded to leave and set up their own chapel providing it was not within 5 miles of the parish church at Dean. In 1704 they began seeking donations, and by 1716 had raised £390, sufficient to begin building. Within a decade the fellowship had become Congregationalist, independently run and free from state interference. This continued until 1797 and the arrival of the Reverend James Kenworthy, a man of faith and enterprise who attracted large congregations, including leading local businessmen like Thomas Ridgway of the newly formed Walsuches Bleach Works. The Ridgways helped Reverend Kenworthy to open a board school at Moor, a Sunday school at Sefton Fold and later at 36 Bottomouth Moor, and a church extension in 1805. The next significant extension, the choir chancel, opened in 1906, was supported by another famous local businessman, that man Lord Leverhulme again, who perhaps surprisingly, given his busy life, was a regular attender and pew holder. A succession of local entrepreneurs, amongst them Adam Mason, Joseph Crankshaw and W.T. Taylor of Victoria Mill, have continued this support down the years. Recently, the chapel has undergone administrative changes, in line with those of the Congregational Church, combining with Lee Lane Congregational Church in 1962 and becoming URC in 1972. But it still continues to be a place of strong faith and community spirit.
Stuart spoke with Nellie Kenwright and Joan Pendlebury and Joyce Yardley about New Chapel and their early memories of Bottomouth Moor.
I was born near our chapel, in New Chapel, and just down, there's some cottages just down there, and I was born there, and my grandma lived in the farm then, at New Chapel Farm, and she was a maternity nurse, and she brought me into the world, and she was most disgusted because I was a little rickling. They used to weigh me in a tomato basket, my mother used to say.
New Chapel was our life, because at the bottom of the moor, your church was of prime importance.
Well, it was your entertainment, wasn't it?
It was.
Really?
There was something on all the time. Yeah.
Went to Sunday school 3 times a day. You went, well, there were services 3 times. You went to Sunday school at morning, then from there you went into chapel to the adult service, and then you went up to Sunday school in the afternoon, and then there was chapel again at night. We used to have ladies' Sundays, and all the ladies took part. You gave them all a job. They either read a hymn or a prayer or a portion of scripture or something, you know, for the service. Yeah, took the collection.
You supported your own minister. We had the manse on Leven Row, where they lived, and next door the chapel owned Martin Cottage.
Yeah.
The minister, all the deacons, the officials of the church, of course, then had to appoint a minister when we were without, and they always liked a minister to have a wife, and the wife would then lead all the ladies of the church, because when I was a girl, I mean, not only did we have this Sunday school, there used to be a young ladies class, a young men's class. It was, the church then was your life.
Well, as you say, the chapel seems to have done an awful lot, doesn't it, down the years? I mean,
It
you
is.
haven't mentioned Rose Queens and
Yes,
bazaars.
they don't have anything like that.
No, it's a pity, isn't it? But these are all things that
Well,
your
they
generation and even mine remember.
Well, yes. I mean, I've got a photograph of my daughter. She was the queen one year, the youngest one. And I made her a dress and everything. Oh.
Yes, the real heart of the community, New
Oh,
Chapel.
yes,
then.
it was then.
And where did people, how far and wide did they come to New Chapel?
Oh, yes. of the sermons, we had to have forks down both sides of the aisles. They were nearly on top of, we were little singers at the front. They were nearly on top of us, you know, they were right close. It was always packed, service, that was in the evening. But there was 3 services then.
So all those years, what's your highlights down the years? What can you remember
Well,
best?
we used to have socials every fortnight, like a social affair and a dance, you know. We used to have dances and everything. We used to run a all-time music hall thing, and we gave lots of plays.
Of course, Moor was a much smaller place in those days, wasn't it? Just the old cottages.
Yes, but
very self-contained.
yes, and with only gas supply.
You did have
gas
supply.
mantles, yes. Yes, a little gas ring, but of course with a coal oven, bungalow range.
Grandad used to say it was no so good, puffing back and smoke, not as good as the black thing.
Yes.
I don't think it ever was really.
No, but it was coal oven bliss.
Yeah.
Oh, because mother was a super cook. Everything was homemade. Everything was fresh and seasonal.
Oh yeah.
Because of course we had seasons then, didn't we?
Grew our own vegetables quite a lot. Well, Grandad did.
Yes.
Well, when you mentioned seasons, as you said, it used to snow then, didn't it?
What?
Oh, definitely.
I remember what was the winter when the worst winter when everyone
1940.
1940.
Yes.
I remember that because that was very vivid because the snow came and we were entirely cut off, weren't we?
We
just
were.
all on our own, and they came because the cottages where we lived
Lower
sort
down.
of were low down.
Yes.
The snow was over the bedroom windows.
We had this huge drift outside, so
And
we
so
couldn't.
we were just hemmed in. I
We
was
were.
quite frightened really until we could sort of, but we couldn't go to school, which was heaven.
No, that's right. And it was my school certificate year, and I was praying, please God, let this snow stay forever, because of course they.
But we were getting short of food, weren't we?
This is the point, because you did not have tin food.
No.
You did have tin salmon and tin pears, but nothing else. Everything was
and we
fresh.
were getting short of food until they cut away up and brought it up on a sledge.
Yes,
to
the
the co-op.
The co-op brought up flour and yeast, and they threw it over the drift.
Yes.
And we caught
we had no bread, and my mother had everything ready, warming, to make this bread. Oh, and it was heaven, we just couldn't wait for it to cook. And I also remember then that somebody died on past the quarry,
up George's Lane.
Up George's Lane. Somebody died, and they couldn't bring him down because they were snowed up, and eventually they brought him down to George's Lane on a sledge.
Well, one of my friends, she was getting married, and the snow was level with the railings down Chapel Lane, so she had to go down on a sledge.
Oh, nicely. Yes, that would be quite a way to arrive, wouldn't it?
Wow, yeah. I don't know if she went on, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Dad set off walking to work. Well, he had to walk, and somehow or other, towards the end of the day, he'd only arrived at the beehive. We never saw him for nearly a whole week because he couldn't get back up to the bottom floor. So there was a message came. How on earth that message came up? Because mother was worried, and his bad leg was all wrapped up in newspaper, so that he wouldn't get frostbite because he hadn't much feeling. And because I remember my mother saying, "Oh, what did you do, Walter?" He said, "Oh, I just he said, "I just washed beer glasses."
Sisters Joan and Joyce also told us about their childhood memories when they lived at 26 Bottom Moor.
Our childhood was idyllic because, of course, we'd all this countryside to play in. And just beyond our house were the fields. Access going down to Coleman's was used to swing on the farm gate, and also just through the gate was what we called the gas meter. It did house a gas structure of some description, and it was about a yard and a half high.
Oh, easily.
Yes,
Quite
with
a
this
big one.
massive stone slab
On
and
the
stuff,
top, yeah.
which was perfect for playing house, shops. I mean, that was our childhood. We could amuse ourselves, you know, all the time with outside games. And of course, beyond, to the left of the farm gate, was a cul-de-sac that we called Down Cinders. We played Down Cinders because at the bottom was the home, the cottage, the home of Papa Carter, councillor. Loved, he was a charming man.
Yes, he was to do with Tuck Row, wasn't he?
He was the one that made sure that water was pumped up, clean water, and he had the Tuck Row pumping station built, which is no longer there. That is just at the top of the Walsuches.
Even in my childhood, I can remember the disruption on Shorley Old Road by farmers bringing the cattle out across the road.
Oh, yes, of course.
They used to bring
Sinker's Farm,
yes.
because of course they didn't have enough ground round for their cattle, and some of them were up Remington and some up Charlie Old Road.
And then we had Nuttall's farm down the old lane of
yes.
that, and their cattle were up near the Blundell Arms, and Granville used to bring these cows down, you know, and
Yes.
the mother used to say, one of those cows will get in our kitchen, you know, to go into the field, and the hay.
So you mentioned Coleman's. You had a little story about Coleman's.
Well, yes, we used to go down the fields, and they had a lovely garden that we could see from the field with bluebells in profusion.
Oh, yes.
And we used to think, well, it'd be all right picking the bluebells because the dogs wouldn't be able to hear us. Those dogs then in the house going right round, but yet as soon as we climbed over that wall to pick the bluebells, they'd start yapping. They were tuned to every child.
They nipped your ankles, didn't
They
they?
did.
Really?
Yes, we were frightened of them, but it still didn't stop us. We used to then circle, as you went down the lane from the bottom of the moor, you turn left at the bottom to the next farm gate, and then circled Coleman's, and you then were on the road that was the culmination of their private drive. Well, just going down there to the left was a huge pear tree. And so we used to be determined to get some of those pears. I don't think we never managed more than one or two,
No,
did
I
we?
don't think so.
Snatching those that were handy because of these yapping dogs. They were better than a burglar alarm. Then you carried on past Coleman's to lead to Devil's Entry, where we were not allowed to go.
So we did.
Yes.
That sounds like a frightening name. Why was it called that?
Oh, no
It
idea.
was
Never
quite
understood.
spooky
It
because
was.
the trees grew over,
Over.
in an arch, and it was muddy, it was
Yes.
messy.
Just a little tiny path among
Yes.
all the stones.
But you
But
came out into
Horwich Lane at the top, yes.
And my mother used to send Grandad on a Monday morning, and I think a Friday morning, to the
Yes.
co-op, out of the way, but to bring, with a shopping list. So he used to take his pipe and his packy, and there was a rocking chair in the shop, so Grandad used to go for the morning.
You could make yourself at home there.
Oh, he did,
Oh, you
yes,
could, yes.
yeah, with a rocking chair. But he always
Yes.
used to come home with it tucked under his arm in a big parcel.
It was it was all wrapped up in brown paper.
Yes, but the sugar
Yes.
was always in a blue bag.
It was.
I remember
yes.
that.
So you mentioned your grandfather there.
Yes.
What did he do?
He was the head ostler at Walsuch's bleach works. He was in charge of, naturally, of all the horses, because it was these huge shire horses that pulled the wagons that carried all the bales of cotton, both along the Walsuches and down Gingham Brew. Now those carts, of course, did have brakes on, those big wheels, but Grandad loved those horses.
Oh, he did.
And every May Day they were decorated, and all the decorations for his horses were all in our wash house. Grandad, incidentally, had 2 offices, and
with a fire in.
yes, his own personal one, where he had his own dinner, because we used to take his dinner daily. Mother made him a hot meal, and I remember Joyce, a baby in the pram, and I'd obviously, whether I was off school, I don't know, or holidays, and the dinner was always at the foot of the pram, and Grandad's favourite was this rice pudding, and I used to be worried all the way along the bottom of the moor when the pram was shaking, and the Walsuches, that's still disgustingly rough, still not been made up. How we got that rice pudding with the skin intact right down to Walsuches, I've no idea. Yes, the butchers came round, the coal men.
Everybody came round.
Everybody came, yes. You didn't need to go down Horwich at all.
Mr. Downs with his fish and his mussels on a Monday morning. Oh.
Tuesday and Friday fish.
But Mother always went to Horwich on a Friday.
She did.
Because she, it was the gossiping time.
It was the day out, yes.
You know, to bring back, and the vanillas.
Yeah, Casey's vanillas. As a matter of fact, Mother had been a mill girl there, yes. But of course you had to finish when you married. And I remember though, when I was at Rivington, and our headmistress was giving us a lecture saying that, girls, I've seen you walking together to school, linking arms. Do not do that. You look like mill girls. So I went home and told my mother, said, you should have said, excuse me, miss, there are mill girls and mill girls.
Returning from the chapel, we cross the lane and head back towards Horwich, towards Whittles Farm via Nellie's Clough. Unfortunately, we don't know who Nellie was. The Whittles are one of the oldest families in the area, and can trace their origins back to the 17th century, when they are mentioned as tenant farmers on the 1620 map of Horwich. Members of the family, noticeably the Hugh Whittles, held important positions in the town until well into the 1800s. Beyond the farm is Avenue Cottage, which used to be the vicarage of Horwich Parish Church in the time of the Reverend Hewitt. It is well documented that he did not see eye to eye with the powerful figure of Joseph Ridgway, who resided at Ridgemont on the opposite side of the road. Their mutual disapproval led to Joseph Ridgway erecting a mound to obscure the view from the vicarage, known as the Hill of Spite, which, for good measure, had the bronze statue of his favourite racehorse on top. And this delight continued beyond the grave, with Joseph Ridgway's will ensuring that Horwich Parish Church did not receive any of his bequests, as long as the Reverend Hewitt remained its minister. Joseph Ridgway was also involved in a dispute with his other neighbours, the Whittles, and erected a high stone wall on that boundary to avoid Mrs. Whittle's prying eyes and gossiping tongue. These pretty Fleet Street properties were built by Robert Eatock in 1777 and fronted the original highway through Horwich before the turnpike improvements brought about Choliol Road as we know it. The stocks at the junction of Fleet Street and Chorley Old Road took its name from the actual village stocks nearby. It was the home of Richard Pilkington, whose diaries written between 1784 and 1797 provide such an insight into life in the area at that time. Bridgemont is now a function venue, but in the 19th century it was the home of the Ridgway family, whose rise to prominence as the founders of modern-day Horwich is told in a previous film. They bought the property, which was previously known as the White House, from Richard Pilkington, the old squire, and the first of 3 generations mentioned in this history. The elevated position of this site lends credence to the view that it was once the forester's dwelling, or even a vacary in the days of the hunting forest, a tantalising thought that propels this whole area back into medieval times, and, in the case of the moors above, even further back to the prehistoric age. All this leads us back once more to the village of Bottomouth Moor, perched beneath the formidable West Pennine moors, with magnificent views across the Lancashire plain to the Pennines and Welsh hills in the distance. We hope that you have enjoyed our tour of this fascinating area with its own unique history. It just goes to show what can be gleaned from a careful look at what is around us. We are sure there is much more to be revealed in years to come. Thank you for watching.